Welcome to this session, The Queering of Society, which is the second in the strand of culture wars debates here today at the Battle of Ideas. I am Claire Fox, I'm chairing this, and all I can say is I'm way out of my comfort zone. This topic is not mine, and I never thought in a long political career that I would ever be discussing the queering of society. Because what the hell's going on? The normalising, however, of queer theory is something that I've spotted over a period of time. I've written about academia and what's happening in the university sector, and in a way you can kind of think, oh, they're all a bit odd over there, right? They're kind of queer theory this, queer theory. Then when you start seeing your local council, your local museum, the art gallery, the Olympics, even the school curriculum referring to queer theory or queer studies, you know something fundamental has changed. And when I've ever raised it, people have just said the problem with you is you're not prepared to challenge heteronormativity. I had to look down because I can't even say it. Right. One of the weirdest examples for me, just because of my potential interest in background, was when I saw a debate on the Northern Irish border called Queering the Peace Process. And then you've got Queers for Palestine at the Gaza protests who want to unpack the multiple intersections of queer politics and the Palestinian struggle. Good luck with that. Anyway, because I don't actually know very much about this, I thought I'd gather a panel who might. And so I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. And it's an open discussion to try and understand what the hell's going on. So I've got James Esses to start with, who's actually done so much in exposing and bringing this issue into the public arena, allowing us to see the way it's been normalised across different organisations. He's a commentator, who I'm sure many of you will know. He's a barrister. He's the co-founder of the Thoughtful Therapists. He's the founder of the Declaration for Biological Reality, which I signed. And he writes a must-read Substack now alongside Matt Goodwin. But if you're not following him on social media, you must, because it's a revelation. So we're delighted to have James with us. We've got Kate Harris. Oh, we'll clap them all at the end. We've got Kate Harris, who self-proclaimed, I'm not, says she's the only queer on the panel. A co-founder and trustee of the LGBT Alliance, a brilliant organisation that was targeted only last week at their national conference as a hate organisation. And that's when you know the world's gone bloody mad, right? The LGBT Alliance has been heroic in their fight for lesbian, gay and bisexual rights. You should read Kate's bio to see who she is and why it matters that she set up the LGBT Alliance. But isn't it remarkable that we need the LGBT Alliance in this day and age? More than ever, I hasten to add, but she will have a particular take on the question. We've then got Graham Linehan. I'm proud to say he's becoming a bit of a battle regular. He was famous as the creator of Father Ted and Black Books and the IT crowd, as we know. He then, in a way, has become almost even more famous as a relentless fighter for women's rights. He's been cancelled as a consequence. But despite their best efforts, his book, Tough Crowd, is actually a bestseller. Tough Crowd. The subtitle of Tough Crowd is How I Made and Lost a Career in Comedy. Well, all I can say is how he made and gained a career in public intellectual work and fighting for what is right. So we're delighted to have you here, Graham. And then we have Frank Furedi, a professor, a sociologist, a social commentator. I mean, what the hell's he doing here? I'm not being funny, but I'm just saying. Ironically,
some of my best friends.
His recent intellectual writings have had to actually confront the mainstreaming of queering. So 100 years of identity crisis, culture wars, over socialization, is one of his recent books. And then the latest one, The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Fight for Its History. Guess what? The whole queering issue is all over those kind of topics, which is why I thought it'd be good to have somebody reflect on that. Can we now give them a warm welcome? You know the drill. They've only got 5 or 6 minutes each, then we open it up. Okay, James.
It's a privilege to be here because I'm essentially the antithesis of somebody who is queer. I am that straight, white, cisgender man that they talk about. Look, I've been speaking on these panels for a few years now, and usually I have to spend time crafting striking arguments to try and persuade you, the audience, to come around to my point of view. But not this year, because for this topic, I can simply let the facts speak for themselves. Now, as was referenced in the blurb for this session, the term queer has multiple meanings. It's gone through various revisions over the years. Well, one lesser-known definition of the term queering is to ruin or spoil something. And in my submission, that is precisely what will happen if we allow society to be queered. It will be ruined and spoiled. Now, some of what I'm going to read out now is crude, even shocking, but I think it's important that you hear it. And so here are just some of the examples of queering that we have witnessed over recent years. Cambridge University Press published an article entitled LGBTQ-Z. In case you were wondering, the Z stands for zoophilia, which is another term for bestiality, human beings sexually abusing animals. The article argued that the Z should be brought into queer theory in order to bring about, quote, the revolutionary power of love. This is abusive. Children's charity Mermaids ran a residential weekend for young children. Speaking about the weekend, one of the staff members described watching a young pubescent girl trying on a breast binder for the first time, saying that it made her queer heart sore. This flies in the face of child safeguarding. The Edinburgh Fringe Festival put on a performance called Blowhole, described as a celebration of queer life and love, teaching audience members how to, quote, perfect the perfect bumhole selfie in the work toilets. I despair. This is crass and crude. Former Labour Party MP Lloyd Russell Moyle was pictured wearing a t-shirt that read, not gay as in happy, but queer as in fuck you. This is aggressive. Stonewall put out a paper called Queering Atrocity Prevention, in which they argue that queerness could have prevented the invasion of Ukraine. This is nonsensical. The National Association for Special Educational Needs ran an event called ADHD and Queer Culture, and the guest speaker was a sexualized drag queen. This is grooming. Kew Gardens recently ran a Queer Nature event delving into the connections between plants in the LGBT community and breaking the binary of plant classification. This is unnecessary. The University of Arts in London ran a project called Queering the City, Transing the Built Environment, and it featured architectural designs for queer buildings, queer ecology, queer signage, queer sport, queer memorials. This is cult-like. Channel 4's queer dating show Naked Attraction recently informed viewers about a new sexuality called ecosexuality, used to describe people who find nature sexy, that's their words, and enjoy having sex with trees. This is creepy. The School of Sexuality Education offers the teaching of queer theory to children in schools. In one published testimonial, a child said, I enjoyed the workshop because it was acknowledged that not all people with boobs or vaginas are female. This is indoctrination. Officials working under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris recently called for a queering of nuclear weapons, which will involve removing nuclear deterrence altogether. This is dangerous. And finally, in a BBC documentary about the sexual atrocities committed by Bill Cosby, they interviewed a queer, non-binary sex therapist who told viewers that she looked forward to, quote, creating a sex-positive world where someone is able to pay conscious women to come and be drugged for a fetish for having sex with unconscious people. This is normalizing rape. I could go on. Abuse, grooming, vulgarity, perversion, indoctrination, danger. In truth, I don't need to add any spin or rhetoric to these examples. They speak for themselves. What was once thankfully confined to Pride Month is now a 365-day-a-year feast of misery. In an attempt to be more accepting and to right historic wrongs that undoubtedly occurred, we have overcompensated and swung the pendulum too far in the opposite direction. As I, for my sins, watched last London New Year fireworks display, I saw that Mayor Sadiq Khan had included a message which lit up the sky and read, "We're queer and you better get used to it." All what, Sadiq? I won't get used to it. I won't allow you, or indeed anyone else, to bully us into accepting child safeguarding nightmares, hypersexualization, illogical and crude identity politics in the name of virtue signalling. As far as I'm concerned, in the modern sense of the term, a queer society is a ruined society, and the sooner society wakes up and realizes it, the better, before it's too late. Thank you very much.
Bloody hell, James. You really didn't spare us. I'm going to start with something very lovely. 5 years ago, Bev Jackson and I were getting nervous and excited. On the 22nd of October 2019, we held the very first meeting of a top-secret organization, soon to become an internationally despised hate group called LGBT Alliance. Bev's here in the front row, and I think I'd like her to stand up and just say how proud I am of what happened 5 years ago, and that we have survived for 5 years, and it's now 2024. And of course, we kicked the ball. We expected somebody else to pick it up. Sadly, they didn't. Here we are 5 years later, but now we do have wonderful chair of trustees, board of trustees. We are a registered charity. We now have 3 employees, and we are working very hard to get back to homosexualizing society and de-queering it. When I was younger, I played lacrosse. In fact, I was so good at lacrosse, I represented northern universities. Anyone else in the room play lacrosse? One person. It's a niche sport. Anyway, the reason I say that is because on a lacrosse field, there's no painted edges. And our little tagline was, "No boundaries, play lacrosse." And that was supposed to enthuse us. No boundaries, you see. I never expected no boundaries to mean that we should be encouraging people to have sex with animals or children. And that, to me, is what queering society is about. The biggest threats that I see of queering society are definitely to children. I'm also appalled to say to animals, to women, and of course, the bit that I'm going to speak about is that it's my view that queer theory has a very specific goal, which is to remove homosexuality from society. I'll just repeat that. To remove homosexuality from society through changes in the law and forced medicalization. I repeat, this is one element because queering is a multi-headed beast. But I want to talk about what I call my triptych. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I've been bleating on about this. If we look around the world, there are 3 pillars, 3 vital pillars that hold up queer theory. One is gender self-ID. This is a tool that allows any man to become a woman and basically get, I think Helen Joyce has said this, an access all areas pass for the rest of his life. No physical changes are needed, and we await the ruling of the Supreme Court in the UK next month to see whether men with a GRC here in the UK, a gender recognition certificate, really are women and lesbians by nature of holding that piece of paper. That is what will be decided in the Supreme Court, and the money is on that the judges may well uphold that. So I and every other lesbian will be told that a man with a gender recognition certificate is a lesbian. And I have to get on with it. As Sadiq Khan says, we're queer, get on with it. So we await that with interest. We also await it with nervousness, given that Labour has promised to make getting a GRC much easier, because we must be kind. The second pillar is implementing a ban on conversion therapy. And again, we're worried. We heard this last week that the Labour government has announced Ray Collins in the Lords and Nia Griffiths in the Commons are going to be responsible for seeing through yet another ban on conversion therapy. So yet again, we have to fight back. But this law is essential. Why? Because it stops people like James from doing his job. It stops what Hilary Cass has recommended, that children who are confused need holistic talking therapy. Now, you'd think, why would people want to ban this? The only answer that I've been able to come up with so far is that the adult autogynephilic men, if you don't know that word, congratulations, and I'm sorry, you're going to have to look it up and find out what it is. But there are many adult men who get a thrill from dressing as women, a sexual thrill, but they refuse to own up to that fetish, and instead they have developed a narrative of the story of a child being born in the wrong body. And therefore, they need this narrative in order to retain their own respectability. We will be fighting that ban with everything we have, and we encourage you, please, do not see this as a niche issue. This is vital to the health and the safeguarding of another generation of children. Then there's hate speech laws. These are absolutely key to limiting anyone's ability to challenge the narrative that a man can be a woman. Thank you, J.K. Rowling, for such powerful messaging on X last year that the Scottish hate legislation appears to have crumbled into dust. She made a laughingstock out of a totally idiotic, unworkable piece of legislation. Yet again, we have to say thank you to J.K. Rowling for everything she puts out in this fight. Activists around the world follow the handbook, which was produced by Denton's and Thomson Reuters Foundation a few years back. The idea is that you stay under the radar, keep any tricky legislation under the radar, such as self-ID, such as conversion therapy, such as self-ID has just gone into law in Austria. Nobody even knew it was there. It was buried in a sea of regulations about the civil service. That is classic Denton's behavior. So what's happened is that maximum damage has been caused around the world with no opposition at all. Until about 2015, when some people noticed what was going on. The wickedness and the success of this ideology lies in the utterly shameless use of former gay, lesbian, and bisexual groups to promote it. Has there ever been a group more involved in driving its own destruction? Every single LGBTQIA+ group across the world is driving the erasure of homosexuality. How can that be? But I want to finish. There's lots more examples, but I'll just wrap up quickly on the fact that all global multinational NGOs, parliaments, etc., except in Turf Island, are happily driving this in the English-speaking world. But I have one piece of good news, which is, and I think this is an extraordinary thing, a presentation by the state of Alabama, the Attorney General, as an amicus curiae in the case of the United States of America versus the Attorney General for Tennessee. It sounds rather boring, doesn't it? I can assure you this is the document that's made me happiest in the last 5 years. I recommend you Google it and read it. Just one example is that it takes down WPATH, which has been driving the medicalization of kids. It takes them down and says the emperor has no clothes. Just one example of how idiotic WPATH is. They recommend castration as medically necessary for children who identify as eunuchs. Shall I leave it at that?
as the queerest person here, I just wanted to defend queer spaces for a second. The way I'd like to do that is in talking about one in particular. It was a John Waters set. John Waters is a director who I really love, even though I've seen very few of his films. I don't really need to see them. But I have read his books. He's a fantastic writer. And if you ever read Shock Value, you will hear the story of how he and a group of friends in Baltimore created a community of oddballs, outcasts, drug addicts, transvestites, gay people, runaways. And that was a John Waters set. And it was, as I believe a lot of queer spaces used to be, and I'm using queer space, it's not a word, it's not a phrase I would normally use, but I'm using it here because I think there is a value to them. A lot of queer spaces are such because they are welcoming to people who have found nowhere else to go. And that's what a John Waters set was. Not only did he create a safe space for these people, but he also made some of them stars. Divine, of course, became famous with, I think it was called You're Only a Man, isn't that? You think you're a man, yes. Gay man there, I presume. He kind of created this little world. Then as time went on, he changed his style. His early films had titles like Mondo Trasho and Hag in a Black Leather Jacket. Pink Flamingos was the most famous one, in which, I hate to tell you, but they thought, let's do the most disgusting thing we can think of, and Divine actually eats dog shit at the end of that film. Yeah, that's why I haven't seen these movies. But then he went on to another stage, and his second stage was more conventional. He had stars like Kathleen Turner, people like that, suddenly starring in his films. And the thing about the latter stage of his career was that he was directly attacking the more conventional world with these kind of what you might call queer concepts that he'd been developing all those years in Baltimore. But here's the thing, he needed those two worlds. He needed both the conventional world that he grew up with and that he also loved, and he needed the other world, the world that he created. The problem with queering society is you destroy both worlds. You destroy the conventional, the kind of settled view of what is real, what is objective, what is good, what is true, what is moral. And you also destroy these spaces because suddenly they're nowhere to be found, because they've been diffused throughout society. So people think that the world is more welcoming, whereas in fact it's not. The world has become a lot lonelier, I think, for these outcasts and these outliers because they have nowhere to go. So what I worry about with queering society is that the shit at the end of Pink Flamingos becomes a river of shit that has broken its banks and is drowning us all. You may also, and John Waters is not the only one who created these worlds. You can see them all over. Another example would be Andy Warhol's factory. There was another place where people were allowed to break boundaries, test themselves, maybe do silly things. Some of them died, some of them didn't make it out. But it was a space where these people could be themselves and could find themselves. I worry that we're not only destroying society with queering society, but I worry we're destroying these havens for some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And that's it. Thanks, Brian.
The bad news is that there is much more to queering than just simply the way the problem presents itself. And one of the things that I think is really important to realize is that the reason why this has spread so fast in so many places isn't just simply because of the surreptitious activities of various NGOs who've been working behind the scenes in the way that Kate explained. There's also a society and a culture that's very hospitable to many of the ideals and the objectives of what queer theory, what queering is all about. I think that's something that we often overlook. And we forget the fact that if society hadn't been such a fertile terrain for queering, it wouldn't have spread so much. And certainly we would not have lost at least 3 generations of young people to many of the ideals that this outlook represents, where it's become very fashionable to be like that. I think it's also important to realize that the language that's used is very specific. So there was a time when transgression actually meant transgression. It actually meant you rebelled, you challenged something. Transgression today is a kind of conformism, where everybody is told to transgress, to break boundaries. Breaking boundaries is no longer something you do once in a while in your life as a rebel. It's something that is expected of you. If you want to be a cool kid, if you want to be, sort of fashionable, then being a boundary breaker is the way you move forward. And there are very few boundaries that are left that have become inviolable. I think it's important to realize the cultural depths of what we're seeing. And I know it's quite tempting to laugh at all the examples that James gave us earlier on, because they are so ridiculous. But it isn't really a laughing matter. It is a deadly serious matter. And a lot of my friends just laugh at this. And they don't realize that while they're laughing, the carpet is being pulled under their feet. Young generations are being directed in the most horrible ways. And something corrosive is happening to our way of life, where, as the speaker before me said, the idea of there being clear spaces for certain kinds of people, whilst another space exists for other kinds of people, is gradually called into question, because it's wrong to have a boundary between these two domains of our experience. Just look at the way the world works, right? Not only is the biological distinction, which has existed for thousands of years between men and women, are now questioned, and anybody that holds that distinction is seen as old-fashioned and somehow illiterate, because they're not coming to terms with the new boundaries that have been undone. So too, every single boundary that's been essential for civilization is now called into question. One of the things that bothers me more than anything in relation to this discussion, as well as other discussions, is the way that the boundary between children and adults is gradually undermined quite systematically. And where you have the adultification of children being treated like as if they're little adults, alongside the infantilization of adults, because the two go hand in hand. Right? That essential boundary, which is essential for adults to take care of children, to be responsible for them and for their upbringing, is gradually whittled away, undermined. Look at the distinction that was mentioned earlier on, I think it was by James, about the way in which the age-old civilizational boundary between humans and animals is now seen as it's so old-fashioned. You're so incorrigible to imagine that somehow the moral status of human beings is particularly special, and you're being speciesist for not understanding that animals too are able to give consent. And there's now actually several journals that are now published in the academic world that argue for the giving of consent for animals. And they actually believe that any kind of sexual relationship between humans and animals is more or less done by equals. Right? And when you look at these journal articles, what I found absolutely nauseating as an academic is the words they use. I mean, they do sound extremely academic. They invented this new vocabulary, which they're kind of putting forward, where essentially it seems like this is a very scientific, thoughtful, reflective sort of worldview. But that's not all, because once these ideals have been confirmed, validated, academically approved, then gradually they seep outwards. And gradually they begin to influence the media, they begin to influence culture, and even people who are not really sort of interested in this begin to understand that unless they sign up and accept this new worldview, they will be ostracized. And just think of all the many people in your life that think exactly the way that most people in this panel think. and yet are too scared to open their mouth. They really are scared to make their views felt because they feel that if they do that, they will be seen as uncaring, they will be seen as prejudiced. And when you have a situation where self-censorship on these issues is so prevalent, then it means that we lost half the battle. Right? It means that we lost half the battle because people are too scared to say what they know to be true. People are too scared to challenge this new kind of conformism. So what I'm really arguing is that according to my analysis, what's at stake here is not just simply the activities of certain NGOs like Stonewall, but our culture underneath it all, the fertile terrain that our culture has created for the breaking of boundaries, for calling into question the legacy of various civilizational accomplishments. Because it's this cultural terrain on which something like queering can flourish that creates the problem for us in the long run. Because even if the word queering no longer existed, there would be something like that that was trying and striving towards the same kinds of ends. And this is something that isn't just simply a problem for gay and lesbian people, it's a problem for heterosexuals as well. It's actually a problem for humanity. Because at the end of the day, queering to me is another word for dehumanization. Thank you.